about. Okay, so what we have been saying is that Maimonides makes the point that when I borrow something from you or you lend something to me, even though I'm not paying, I obviously have a lot of liability. We discussed that many times, that if anything happens to it, even if it's beyond my control, the borrower is liable. So we're not going to talk about the liability right now, but let's talk about what are the rights of the borrower. And the rights of the borrower are that if I borrowed for a certain project or a certain period of time, the owner cannot request his item back. And if I come to you and say, can I borrow your bicycle for 2 hours? And then half an hour later, you want it back. So even though it's your bicycle, but no, you cannot have it back until the time is up. As we mentioned 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. But now we're going to elaborate upon that and bring a few more cases, and then we move to the next concept. But what's the logic? Logic is seemingly you say, what do you mean? It belongs to the owner. He did me a favor, so why can't he go back on the favor? So Maimonides said last time, he says, look, he says, the question of ownership has nothing to do with whether or not I, the borrower, paid. What's the proof? The proof is if I buy something, it's mine, but something could become mine without buying it. For example, if you give me a gift. Now, if you give me a gift and it becomes mine, you can't change your mind, right? Even though I didn't pay for it, the person receiving the gift didn't pay for it. But what Maimonides is doing is showing that ownership, the question of ownership, has nothing to do with whether I paid or not. Payment is one form of receiving ownership, but it's not the only form. And therefore, he says, the same thing is with borrowing, and he compares borrowing to renting. Right? Just like he compares a gift, which is permanent ownership without paying money, to a sale, which is permanent ownership because I paid money. So he says the same thing is with compare borrowing to renting. When I rent, I get ownership for a period of time because I paid the owner. And when I borrow, I get a certain ownership for a certain period of time. I get ownership for a certain period of time without paying, even though I didn't pay. But the fact that I didn't pay does not take away from my ownership, temporary ownership, and therefore the owner cannot have his item back until the period of time has been fulfilled. That is what we said last time. Now what we're going to do is we're going to think about not when the borrower borrowed something for a set period of time, but if he borrowed something for a specific project. And then the question becomes, could you retract during that project? The answer is going to be no. We're going to read a few cases. Again, relatively straightforward, not that complicated. So we'll read a few of the pieces and we go to the next chapter, and the next chapter becomes a little bit more complicated because you have debate, etc. So let's share the Maimonides. Let's continue reading about the borrower. Any comments or questions, please share either now or at any time. And here we go. So we are chapter 1 of Laws of Borrowers, section 6. When a person borrows a utensil for the sake of performing a particular task, the person who lent it cannot force the borrower to return it from his possession until the borrower performs that task. Similarly, if he borrows an animal in order to travel to a particular place, the owner may not compel the borrower to return it until he goes to that place and returns. So if in section 5 that we read last time we discussed the Maimonides, it was referring to a case where I borrow for a period of time. I say, can I borrow your donkey for 30 days or your axe for 30 days? Here, we're talking about not a period of time, but I say I need it for a specific project, or I need to borrow the animal so I can go somewhere. So in that case, the owner cannot take it back until I concluded what I intended to do. And now we have different cases, 7, 8, 9, 10, different cases but it's all the same principle. So here we go. Let's go through some of the cases. When a person asks a colleague, lend me your spade or hoe to hoe this orchard, right? So I have to prepare the orchard. I guess they would plow it to make it more to just be able to rain. So he is allowed to hoe only that particular orchard. He may not hoe another orchard with it. So now we're limiting the borrower. If I say, can I borrow your tool to use it for this orchard, then it's only this orchard, okay? If the borrower said to hoe an orchard without describing it further, he may use it to hoe any orchard he desires, but only one orchard. If he borrowed it to hoe his orchards, so I come to you and I say, can I borrow your axe, your plow? Because I have to plow my orchards. So then I could do all my orchards. And this is very, very interesting. Even if the iron of the spade becomes entirely worn away while hoeing, it is sufficient for him to return the wooden handle to the hoe. Similar laws apply to all analogous situations. So we're talking about I borrow a tool and I'm going to use it so much that it's going to get ruined. But I'm using it, but I'm doing exactly what I said. I said, I'm borrowing your tool to plow my fields. I happen to have 5-10 fields. Your axe may get ruined or your hoe may get ruined in the process. Okay, so I'll return to you just the wooden handle of the axe. But again, why is this allowed? Isn't the borrower responsible to return it in perfect condition? Well, no, the borrower has permission to use it. So as long as I'm using it consistent with what I told the original owner, I'm allowed to do so. Now, if you thought 7 was surprising, 8 will be a little bit more surprising. The following rules apply when a person borrows a utensil from a colleague to use and tells him, lend me this item according to your generosity. Now, there's different opinions of exactly what he said, but what we assume that means the following. That expression implies, don't lend it to me like others who lend out articles, but according to the goodness of your heart and your generosity, that you will not be concerned about the time, even if it becomes extended. So it's not clear what the Talmudic word is. There are different opinions what the Talmudic word is, but all agree regarding what the word means, all agree that it's clear that I'm telling you I want to borrow this item, but don't lend it to me like normal people lend for a certain period of time. You're going to lend it to me for as long as I want. So if a kinyan was established with the lender concerning this, so here is one of those cases where you have to make a formal act of acquisition. That's called a kinyan. So if I make a formal act of acquisition, the borrower may use the article without limits until it is no longer suitable to perform its function. He must then return its broken pieces and remnants. The borrower may not, however, fix the utensil and thus make it useful again. So I borrow your hammer and I say, look, could you lend me your hammer, but not the way normal people lend hammers. Lend me the hammer out of the goodness of your heart. That may or may not be, that's Maimonides' interpretation of the Talmudic statements. But the bottom line is it means no limit. So then I can use the hammer as long as I want, even if the metal part of the hammer gets worn out and it breaks into pieces, I could still continue using it until I can't use it anymore. Once I cannot use it anymore, I have to return the broken pieces to you. You cannot fix it. The borrower cannot fix it and continue using it. And then here's another similar case, but if a person asks a colleague, lend me this stone tub of water, and it was destroyed, he may not rebuild it. If the borrower asks the owner, lend me a stone tub without any description, and it is destroyed, he may rebuild it. So in other words, the way they would feed the animals, they would make a stone, he calls it a stone tub. Stone is because the stone, if it's earth, the water would dissipate. So you put water in a stone tub of water, and then the animals could drink, for example. So if I say this one, can I borrow this stone tub of water? And you say yes, and then it breaks. You don't have to replace it. I can't fix it. It's only this one that broke. So the deal is off. But if I say, could you give me, the borrower asked the owner, lend me a stone tub without any description, then if it breaks, I can fix it. If he asked him, lend me the place of a stone tub, if a kinyan was established, if an act of acquisition was established, affirming this agreement, the borrower may build on the property of the lender until he constructs a stone tub that he may use to water his animals or irrigate his land, as he stipulated when speaking to the lender. Okay, no major news here. What we are saying here, we keep reiterating, is that when you lend somebody to something to somebody, you have to be careful what you're committing to, because just like the borrower, by the act of borrowing, gets a liability. So essentially, he's a insurance policy that he's guarding your item. He also has certain rights, and those rights are connected to what was stipulated. So you got to be careful before you lend out your item if you want it back. So in other words, if you want it back right away, be careful, be clear as I'm giving it to you for 2 hours, etc. If a person borrows an inn from a colleague to spend the night, the intent is no less than 1 day. To spend the Shabbat, the intent is no less than 2 days. For marriage, the intent is no less than 30 days, right? In those days, the weddings were a whole month-long celebration. So if I come to you and I say, can I borrow your house for the wedding? And you say, yes. 2 days later, you want me out. So we say, no. We said in the beginning, if it's a set period of time, then you can't throw me out as long as that set period of time has not been concluded. So what Maimonides is saying here, quoting from the Talmud, there are certain statements that imply a certain amount of time, even if it was not said explicitly, right? When a person borrows a garment from a colleague to visit a person in mourning, right? I don't have a nice suit, so I say, can I borrow your suit? I have to go to a shiva call. He may keep it for the time it takes to go and return. When a person borrows a garment to attend a wedding celebration, he may keep it for that entire day. If he borrows it for his own wedding, he may keep it for at least 7 days. So in other words, right, I come to you and I say, can I borrow your tuxedo? I'm getting married, right? You say yes. The morning after the wedding, you want it back. I say, 1 second. I said it's for my wedding. My wedding, everybody knows the 7-day period celebration after the wedding. So you can't get it back. So I don't want to give it back to you until the 7 days are over. So I'm not saying this is a good policy to do. The guy did you a favor, you could be nice to him. But legally, the owner of the garment cannot ask me to return it before that 7-day period had passed. Okay, so that's a whole list of laws. Like I said, basically pretty much copied and pasted from the Talmud. And it's continuing on the principle that we said before, that when I borrow something from you, like you said last time, if I borrow without any given date or without any purpose, I just say, can I borrow your hammer? Then you can take it back whenever you want. But if I say, can I borrow it for 30 days? Okay, then you can't ask it back before the 30 days are up. If I say, can I borrow your hammer? I need to build my sukkah. Okay, you can't take it back before my sukkah is completed, etc., as we spelled out. So that's pretty much what we said last time. Now you want to shift to a new topic. It's not completely new because it was alluded to earlier and we discussed it at some length, but it's taking it in a different direction. So unless there's any comments or questions, we will continue to the next chapter. But first, I'm going to pull up a page or two to give us some background here in the Torah. Pull up a page or two in the Torah. Okay.
Rabbi Feldman, can I ask a question about the previous topic?
Yes.
So in a case where the borrower specifies that he can borrow it for unlimited period of time or however long they want, how is it different from gifting or charity? And why do they need to give back the pieces?
Oh, that's the difference between a gift. If you give me a gift, if you give me the gift, then it's mine, and the original owner has no connection to it. Borrowing means I'm borrowing the usage. So legally, the object does not belong to me. The only thing that belongs to me is the ability to use it. And therefore, if it breaks, first of all, I have to give you back the raw material. But even if it doesn't break, if it breaks when I'm using it in the normal course of action, What happens if it breaks because I was negligent? What happens if it was stolen? If you give me a gift and it was stolen, you can't bill me. It's mine. I can keep it. But if you lent it to me, even without a deadline, and you said explicitly, for as long as I want, you only gave me the right to use, not the ownership of the object. So if the object is then lost or stolen, or anything else happens to it, except for breaks in the normal while using it in the normal way of using it, as we discussed, that was the only time that the borrower, one of the only two exceptions where the borrower is not liable. So if it was, let's say, if it was stolen, I would have to return to you. I would have to pay you for the value of the object, even though you said I can use it for however long I want. Yeah, but you retain the ownership. So why would you do this? I don't know. Maybe it's your grandmother's axe. Maybe it's a sentimental value. Maybe you want to one day pass it on to your children, but your children are very young. You don't want to worry about it. So you go to your neighbor, you say, your neighbor comes to you, can I borrow it? You say, yeah, you can borrow it for as long as you want, as long as you're going to use it. But I retain the ownership. What do you gain? If it breaks, you get it back. If it's stolen, you get it back. Right? So I'm not saying this is a very common occurrence. I don't think it's so common. Why would I lend you something for no end? Remember like this. Remember, and let's say I borrowed it and I say I'm borrowing it and there's no time limits. If I'm not using it, I don't want it in my garage. It's just going to cost me. It's just all it is I'm giving the other guy free insurance, right? I have liability, all right? I'm not going to have liability. I'm not going to retain the liability unless I'm using it, right? But the key difference is, forget about why I'm doing this. I mean, I just spoke for a few seconds why I'm doing it, but the bottom line is the legal status of this object is the owner owns the object. The borrower has permission to use it. So we're separating between ownership and usage. So that's the distinction. Now, I could see cases where we would want to make this agreement. I don't see many cases that way, but I see some cases where we would make that agreement.
And where is it enforceable? In court or just between people?
It's enforceable in court. If, again, assuming we all agree. If we don't agree what happened, then you need witnesses to testify what happened. But assume there were witnesses, or assuming we agree on the facts, then you in the Jewish court would enforce it. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, to get to the next piece, I'm happy to jump into the next piece, but I need a little bit of, we need to make it interactive in the sense that if I'm not being clear, you have to stop me. That has to be the unspoken agreement here, because I don't want to go off the reservation if we're not on the same page. Okay, we're still talking about the laws of borrowers. We spent some time about this law before. Today, we're going to talk about the parameters of the law. What was the law that we're going to talk about? So we said as follows. We said the borrower is always liable. I borrow your object. Something happens. It's out of my control. It was stolen. The mafia came and took it. A tsunami came. It doesn't matter if it's my fault or not. Unlike other guardians, like the paid guardian and the unpaid guardian, the borrower gets all the liability, even if it was not his fault. And the logic we said earlier was, since the borrower gets all the benefits, the borrower gets all the liability. As opposed to, for example, if I rent it from you, yes, I'm getting the right to use it, but I'm also paying you. So the person renting gets some benefit, the usage, and the owner gets some benefit, which is the money in the bank account. So when you divide the benefit, you divide the liability. But the borrower, since the borrower gets all the liability, since the borrower gets all the benefits, if I borrow your object, I get to use it, you get nothing in return. Therefore, all the liability is mine. And no matter what happens, even if it's out of the control of the borrower is responsible. There are two exceptions where the borrower would not be responsible. One exception is the object broke or animal died in the normal course of usage. I borrow your hammer to knock in a nail, While I'm knocking in a nail in the normal fashion, the hammer breaks. That is one exception I don't have to pay. Let's not talk about that right now. We're going to talk about the other exception. The other exception is very difficult to explain. Many people tried. We discussed it in the past. I'm not sure we fully finished that point, but we discussed it. And it's not even clear if it is logical or just a decree from the Torah, but we discussed it. So see if you remember. The exception is, and again, this is not from the rabbis, this is built in, it's in the biblical verse. If I borrow your item, but I borrow you with the item. In other words, you're present here with the item. And then something goes wrong and it breaks or dies or gets stolen or gets destroyed, then I'm not liable. So for example, if I say, Vicky, can I borrow your hammer? You say, yes, I'm completely liable. If I say, Vicky, do me a favor, could I borrow your hammer? And also, could you help me build? Right? So you're on the scene. So you're on the scene, then it's like, even though I borrowed your hammer, it's like you're here. So it's like I never got it. So you're here, so it's still in your possession, so I'm not liable. That could be a reason. It's not that it doesn't always work because the Talmud discusses the parameters of what does it mean the owner is with him? Does the owner have to be there the entire time or only part of the time? So it gets complicated. But that's the basic verse, right? I'm going to show you the verse right now. It's in Exodus chapter 22. So this is the verse. The verse is like this. If a person, and vichi, you'll see in a minute, this and is critical. And if a person borrows an animal from his neighbor and it breaks or limb or dies, if its owner is not with him, he shall surely pay. In other words, I always have to pay. The borrower always has to pay. If the owner is with him, in Talmud, that's called she'ila b'bailim. I'm borrowing, but I'm also borrowing with the owner. The owner is present. So let's go to verse 14. If its owner is with him, he shall not pay. If it is a hired animal that has come for its hire, we'll leave that alone. That's talking about a renter. That's not talking about a borrower. So what do we know here in verse 14 and 13? We know if I borrow an item, I'm always liable. If it breaks, I'm liable. If the owner is with me, then I don't have to pay. Right? If you want to comment on this, please do. It's the law. We discussed it in the past. Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? I'm willing to open it up with the discussion again if you want, but that is the law. If you want, you could do, yeah, so that's the law. Let me look back at my notes to see if we said anything super brilliant on this. I'm not sure we did. Oh, so we discussed this. We talked about the Sefer HaChinuch. I think we actually looked at it. We may have looked at it inside the book of education, which discusses the reasons for the mitzvot, 13th century book. And he says, look, if the owner is there, the owner should be responsible. The tsunami came and the owner is there, then it's like it's still in the owner's possession. The owner is responsible. Okay, fine. That's what we discussed there. Now we get to an interesting Talmudic dispute. How broad is the parameter of this, so to speak, a leniency that the borrower does not have to pay if the owner is present? Does it apply only to a case of a tsunami, something completely out of the control of the borrower? Does it apply also to something that is actually closer to where I have some degree of liability, if it was lost or stolen? And then the question becomes, the most extreme question is, does that apply to a case where I'm negligent? The borrower is negligent. So when you look at the Torah and you want to talk about the laws of the borrowers, it's very easy to make a chart. I don't have the chart here, but let's make it in the mind's eye. You basically have 4 types of borrowers, and then you have 3 or 4, but let's keep it 3 for the simplicity. You have 3 types of events that could occur. So one event, it's an onus, it's completely out of my control. We'll call it the tsunami. The next category is things that it's not negligence, but if I was careful, I would be able to avoid it. For example, it was stolen. Somebody broke into my house and stole it. It's not negligence that someone broke into my house. I didn't leave the door wide open, but if I tried harder, I probably could hire a security company and keep my house safe. So that's sort of the in-between ground. And then there's negligence. And negligence is what they call pshia. If I leave it on my front porch and I'm negligent, well, not in Greenwich. In Greenwich, leave it on your front porch may not be negligence. I don't know. But if you leave it on your front porch, if you're negligent, you don't do the basic responsibility of the borrower to protect it, then all cases you're liable, no matter what type of guardian you are. So basically, we have 4 types of guardians and 3 types of scenarios. Now, when you tell me that the borrower does not have to pay if the owner is present, does it apply to the tsunami? Does it also apply to the stolen object? Or does it also apply to the case of the negligent case? So in other words, I say, Vicky, can I borrow your hammer? You say, yes. I say, Vicky, can you help me on my field with the hammer? You say, yes. You're on the scene. I'm negligent. Could I say, well, the Torah says that if the owner is there, is not liable? Or could Vicky say, yeah, but Menachem, you were negligent. If you're negligent, you have to pay. So that's the discussion. It's not a long discussion in the Talmud. Maimonides just says it. He doesn't even tell you it's a big deal. But in the Talmud, it's a back and forth. But the reason why I want to spend time on this, because it's very interesting, because here we see how the rabbis are debating the biblical verses. So I'm going to open up the biblical verses. I'm going to read a few verses, and I'm going to try to convey the disagreement here and how Maimonides rules. And if it's interesting and if it's not boring, we can also look at it in the Talmud. So I'm sharing the same verses again, chapter 22 in the book of Exodus. Okay, so we have different forms of guardians and we have the different laws. How we know exactly which verses are referring to each guardian is a broader discussion. So some of it you have to accept, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to defend the Talmudic thesis, but let's see how this works. So we're beginning with verse 9. Verse 9, according to the rabbinic interpretation, verse 9 and 10 refers to the unpaid guardian. If I'm an unpaid guardian, what's the law? I don't have to pay if it's lost or stolen, but if I'm negligent, I have to pay. Now let's see if we see this in verse 9 and 10. So verse 9 and 10, again, unpaid guardian. If a man gives his neighbor a donkey, a bull, or a lamb, or any animal for safekeeping, and it dies, breaks a limb, or is captured, and no one sees it, right? So you gave me your donkey, your bull, your lamb. You want me to guard it? It dies, breaks a limb, or is captured. Again, there's no negligence here. How do we know there's no negligence? You'll see in a minute in verse 10. The oath of the Lord shall be between the two of them, provided that he did not lay his hand upon his neighbor's property, and its owner shall accept it, and he shall not pay. So in other words, as long as I don't do something negligent, I don't have to pay. That's talking about, according to the rabbinic tradition, that's talking about a shomer chinam, an unpaid guardian. Verse 11 and 12 is referring, according to the sages, to the paid guardian. But if it is stolen from him, he shall pay its owner. 1 second. Verse 9 says you don't pay the owner. Verse 11 says you do pay the owner. What do? Well, it's a contradiction. So the sages say, well, it's no question. Verse 9 and 10 is talking about an unpaid guardian. Verse 11 is talking about a paid guardian. Okay. Now, Verse 13. Verse 13 is the borrower. Earlier we read 13 and 14. Verse 13 is the borrower. And if a person borrows an animal from his neighbor and it breaks to them or dies, if its owner is not with him, he shall surely pay. If his owner is with him, he shall not pay. So 13, 14 is the borrower. 11 and 12 is the paid guardian. And 9 and 10 is the unpaid guardian. That's the order. And the renter is the end of verse 14, but let's leave the renter out. So in other words, we talk about unpaid, paid, borrower. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, the way the Torah works, the Torah doesn't tell you every single case, every scenario of the borrower and unpaid borrower. The unpaid guardian, the paid guardian, and the borrower. For that, you have to use your Torah gives you one instance, one case or two cases, and you have to flesh out the rest of the picture. So the issue is like this. The issue is that when it comes to the unpaid guardian talks about negligence. I have to take an oath that I was not negligent. That's the meaning of that. That's the rabbinic interpretation of that verse. I have to take an oath that I'm not negligent, which implies I have to take an oath that I'm not negligent. Okay. The second case, the next group, that's verse 9 and 10. Verse 11 and 12 is the paid guardian, but the case that we talk about in the paid guardian is if it was stolen. Okay. Then we say the borrower, if it breaks or dies is out of my control. The animal had a heart attack. The borrower could do nothing. Breaks or dies, it's out of the control of the borrower. So when we talk about the borrower, you say if the borrower borrows something and it's out of his control and it dies, he has to pay unless the owner is with him. Now the question is, if the owner is with him and it dies out of my control, I don't have to pay for it. Got it. What happens if the owner is with me, but it was stolen? Am I exempt from paying because the owner was with me? And what happens if the owner was with me and I was negligent? Am I exempt from paying for negligence because the owner was with me? So this is a debate. What does it depend on? So a very interesting question here. Again, I hope it's not too detailed here. Go ahead, Vicky.
My question was, does the owner serve, when he's there, does he serve as a witness?
Let's assume everybody agrees on facts. Let's assume there's no dispute of that. We don't need any witness because everyone agrees on the facts. Our question right now is, so it's not a question of what happened, it's a question of the law. In other words, we know for sure that if you're the owner and you give me your donkey and the donkey drops dead, the borrower has to pay. It wasn't my fault, but the borrower has to pay. If the owner is with me, then I don't have to pay if it's out of my control. The question is, what happens if the owner was with me and I was negligent? And that's why the owner dies. There was a heat wave and I took the animal out to work. And that's why the owner died. So I would be liable. But the question is the fact that the owner was there, is that exempt me from negligence? That's the big question here. What does it depend on? It depends on one letter. That's why I'm bothering you with all these details, because it's interesting. It depends on one letter. What does it depend on? Verse 13 that introduces the case of the borrower doesn't say if a person borrows, it says and if a person borrows. Now in Hebrew, the and is not even a letter, it's just a prefix, it's just one letter. The. That vav makes it and if a person borrows. What does the and mean? And connects it. So that everybody agrees that whatever it says in 13 and 14 is a continuation and therefore relates to 11 and 10. Now the question becomes, now 11 also says, but if. It's actually not but, it's actually and if, ve'im, and if. Now, 11 and 12 are related to 10 and 9. The question is, when you say the and in 13, in the Talmudic language, is the 13 connected to the previous portion or also to the previous portion? In other words, what we're saying in 13, does it apply to the scenarios laid out for the paid guardian, or is it also applied to the scenarios laid out to the unpaid guardian, which is the previous section? See what I'm saying? Why is this relevant? Because the paid guardian says nothing about negligence. It only says about stolen. So all agree that if it was stolen and the owner was there, the borrower is not liable. The question becomes, and there's a Talmudic debate, the Maimonides rules, but the question becomes, what happens if the borrower is negligent, but the owner is there? Now the question, is the owner exempt? Is the borrower exempt because the owner was there? Does that apply to a case of negligence as well? Now, negligence is only written on this page in verse 9 and 10, which is referring to an unpaid guardian. So one opinion says yeah, one opinion says no. The opinion that says no says that verse 13 that starts with an and connects this law of the borrower to the law of the paid guardian, which is a case of stolen. That's the case that's mentioned there. But it's not connected to the previous portion, the unpaid guardian, which mentions negligence. There's another opinion that says no. When you say and, the law, the paid guard, verse 13 says and, which connects it to the previous portion, but verse 11 is also says and. I know it says but it's should be an and, ve'im, and. And verse 11 says and, connecting it to 9 and 10. So which means that verse 13 is connected not just to 11, but also to 9. In other words, when you say two ands, is the third portion going back only one step or two steps? And if it's going back two steps, then it recovers also the case of a negligence, because verse 9 mentions negligence. It refers to negligence. Really 9 and 10 refer to negligence according to the rabbinic tradition, rabbinic interpretation. And therefore, if you believe the and connects not just 13 to 10, but 10 also has an and. So 13 is connected to 10 and then to 11 and then to 9. So then the story of the borrower is connected not just to the story of the paid guardian, but also to the story of the unpaid guardian. And therefore, the exemption of the owner being present makes the borrower not liable, applies also to negligence as well. That's the Talmudic debate. Maimonides says, yes, it does apply all the way back. Why Maimonides rules this way is another question, but I think it's just interesting to see how the Talmud, and I could show it to you in time, if you still have patience, we can just look at it in the Talmud, but you have 3 sections. Each is connected with an and. There are 2 ands between section 1 and 2. There's an and, and between section 2 and 3, there's an and. So now the question is section 3 related just to section 2? And 2 is related to 1, but 3 is not related to 1, or is 3 related to 1 as well? So it turns out from Maimonides that 3, we're going to follow the opinion that 3 is related to 1 as well. So all the cases that are discussed in the scenario of the unpaid guardian and the paid guardian, when 13 comes in and says borrower, and is the law of the borrower, which means what? If the owner is with him, he's exempt. That applies back and is connected back, not just to the previous case, but the 2 previous cases. So therefore, the exemption of the owner being there makes the borrower not liable, applies not only to something that's out of my control, but also to theft, which is a little bit more in my control, but even to negligence, if you say it goes back 2. If it only goes back 1, then it covers only theft, but it does not cover negligence. So I just thought it was interesting to show how the Talmud is reading the Chumash, the Bible, and how one letter, that ve'im, the and, that one letter and, that vav, the and is significant. And how significant is it? In other words, how far back do you go? That's the debate. Go ahead, Vicky.
Oh, I was just wondering if that logic is applied anywhere else, or just this particular law.
It's not just this particular law, the concept of the debate, whether, right, because we know in the Torah, things could be the juxtaposition of laws has significance. The question is, what is the meaning of juxtaposition? Is it related to only what's immediately before it, or also what's before that. So I can't recall offhand, but there are the question in the language of the Talmud, Mikra Nidrash Lefanav or Lifnei Fanav. Is a verse connected to what's before it or also to what's before what's before it, right? So that concept is probably broader, but this is actually interesting because there's a vav, there's an and. So let me just do a quick search and see if there's other easy cases that come to mind.
Well, that should be enough in order to apply that logic if you see it something else, because it's a precedent.
Yeah. Now there's many cases. Yeah. Yeah. For example, there's the second portion of the Shema says that if you don't do these commandments, you're going to be exiled. You say it in the Shema every day, the second paragraph of the Shema. Now the question is, well, you won't have long life, okay? Because he says if you keep these commandments, you're going to have long life in the land of Israel. So the implication is, if you don't keep these commandments, you're not going to have long life in the land of Israel. So now the question is, what mitzvot are we talking about? Because there's a series of mitzvot. So is it mezuzah? Is it tefillin? Is it Torah study? How far back does the conclusion and say, do all this so that in order that your days will be prolonged? How far does that go? Does that mean mezuzah, which is the last one before it? Does it mean tefillin, which is the second to last, or Torah study, which is third to last? Right. So that's another case. And like I said, there's other cases like that. So it's really a question of how far back does a verse go? Does it only connect to what's immediately before it, or even to what's before that?
Thank you. And it doesn't mean that has to be an end, the word end.
Yeah, if there's no and, it doesn't necessarily connect. Both, but here it says an and the other case that I told you, it says lema'an, in order. So obviously in order is so that's a continuation, right? It's not an and, but it's a continuation. Do this in order that your days should be prolonged on the land, right? So in order obviously connects it. The question is, how far back do you connect? Is it just the last thing we said, mezuzah? Is it tefillin? Is it Torah study? Right? How far back are you going to go? So that's the question.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Now, if anyone has a minute or two, I could just read it in the Talmud very quickly, if you want. If not, if it's already 10:48.
Sure.
Okay, fine. Let's do that. The Talmud gets more complicated. I'm going to go to it, goes back and forth. It's a whole dance. But I'm going to go to the place where it's summarized. Where it's summarized that will help us get in and out quicker. I'm not going to be able to explain every detail here, but I think 90% of what we're going to read, I already talked about. Okay, so this is, again, the Talmud. So it's Baba Metzia is the name of the tractate page. What page is it? 95a. Okay, so let's scroll down a little bit. Okay, we'll read a little bit. We'll see what happens. Itmar. An Amoraic dispute. Amoraic is, so there's the Tanaim are the sages of the Mishnah. And then once the Mishnah was concluded, the rabbis that are quoted in the Talmud that explain the Mishnah are called Amoraim, the speakers, the talkers. So there's an Amoraic dispute was stated. With regard to a mishap that occurred due to a borrower's negligence in safeguarding a deposit he borrowed together with the service of the owner, right? So what did we say? Usually, we say it's negligence. Usually everybody's liable in negligence, no question about that. Here the problem is the borrower was negligent, but it was together with when he borrowed together with the service of the owner, meaning the owner is present. So we know that the owner is present is an exemption. The question is, does that exemption apply also to negligence? So we have a dispute. Rav Acha and Ravina disagree. One says he is liable, one says he is exempt. Now we're going to say, what is this? What is the reasons for the disagreement? The one who says he is liable, in other words, that the exemption does not apply to the case of negligence, holds that the verse beginning and if he borrows, that's the verse 13 that we were discussing, the verse that introduces the law that a borrower does not have to pay if the owner is present, which details the exemption from liability when the borrower, when one borrows an item together with its owner, is expounded in connection with the passage preceding it, i.e. that of a paid bailee, but not in connection with the passage preceding the one preceding it, i.e. that of an unpaid bailee. In other words, that's the first step, right? He says, when you have a passage, you connect it to you expound it, you explain it in connection to the previous, to the preceding one, but not the one preceding the one that preceded. And now we explain. Accordingly, the verse, if the owner is with him, he does not pay, which appears in the passage of a borrower, is not written in reference to the unpaid bailee. In other words, the unpaid guardian, where negligence is an issue. And so that exemption from liability does not apply to him. And in addition, the liability of negligence, which appears in the passage of an unpaid bailee, is not written in reference to a paid bailee or a borrower. Accordingly, the liability of a paid bailee and of a borrower in the case of negligence is derived only via an a fortiori inference from the liability of an unpaid bailee, not from an explicit verse. So I didn't discuss this. How do you know that a borrower and a paid bailee are obligated in the case of negligence? There's no verse for that, but that's logic. That's a kal vachomer, a fortiori, but it's kal vachomer. If something applies to the lesser case, it applies to the more severe case. So if a unpaid guardian is liable for negligence, a paid guardian who has to watch even more certainly is liable for negligence. So the way we know they're liable, you don't need the verses. That's logic. The question is the exemption. That's what he's getting at now. But it is not possible to derive that even a paid bailee and a borrower are exempt in cases where they took hold of an item together with borrowing the service of the owner. And a mishap occurred due to their negligence. What is the reason for this? When it is written, if its owner is with him, he does not pay, that is in reference only to a borrower and to a paid bailee. Even then, it is written in reference to only those liabilities that are written explicitly with regard to them. It is not written with regard to the liability of negligence, which is derived only through a fortiori inference. Consequently, the borrower and the paid bailee are liable for negligence, even in a case where they also borrow the services of its owner. In other words, long story short, in simple English, what it's saying is the liability, the negligence, the way you know someone is liable for negligence, that's logic. But the way you know someone is, but if you want to apply the exemption for negligence, which begins with the third guy, it begins with the borrower, that does not extend all the way back. In other words, the fact that when the owner is present, the borrower is exempt, that does not extend to the case of negligence, which is only explicitly mentioned 2 sections before. The other guy says, conversely, the one who says that a borrower is exempt holds that the verse, and if he borrows, which details the exemption from liability in a case where one borrows an item together with its services of its owner, is expounded in connection with its passage preceding it, i.e. that of a paid bailee, and also in connection with the passage preceding the one preceding it. That's the Talmudic line. If you ever discuss someone who's an expert in Talmud and you say, oh, what did you discuss today? Say, I discussed the dispute whether a passage is expounded based on the preceding section or the one preceding the preceding one. And this guy believes it's preceding the preceding one. Therefore, and accordingly, when it is written, if the owner is with him, he does not pay, this exemption is written also in reference to an unpaid bailee, limiting his liability, even in the case of negligence, because the case of negligence, although it's not written before the passage of the borrower, it's written before that path. It's the one preceding the one preceding it, and this opinion says that it applies that far. Now, for 1 second, let's just run back to Maimonides, if I still have him here, and we'll see all this discussion that we basically spent 55 minutes on. Maimonides just gives 1 word to. Section 2, borrowers. When a person borrows an article while the owner is working with him, he is not liable, even if the article that he borrowed is stolen or lost through negligence. So we just spent an hour trying to figure out if it applies to negligence. Maimonides says yes. Now, had we not opened the Talmud, we wouldn't know if this is in dispute. Had we not opened the verses of the Torah, we wouldn't understand why there's a Talmudic dispute. But now we have all the background. Now we see Maimonides just said one word. He said, even if the article borrowed is stolen or lost through negligence. Ay avad b'pshia. 3 words. Ay avad b'pshia. So we basically spent 55 minutes discussing these 3 words. Congratulations. Okay, thank you very much for joining. I hope this was interesting. Next week we continue, God willing, in good health.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.